Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am thrilled to be joined once again by Stephen Yoch, author of the novel Becoming Benedict Arnold. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you again, Colin. Thank you.
So your first novel that we talked about in season 1 of our podcast was Becoming George Washington, and your new novel is Becoming Benedict Arnold. I'm curious, while you were working on Becoming George Washington, at what point did you see Benedict Arnold as the main character of his own story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, it's George and Benedict become very intertwined in the Revolution, and I kept being exposed to him, and his story is so great and unique and surprising that I just knew that was my next story. I mean, I look for interesting stories, and his was so great. And by the way, so few people know it. So I was drawn to it.
Well, tell us about what drew you into his story. I guess if you could actually go all the way back to his upbringing and how he became intertwined in the American Revolution the way he did.
Yeah, it all starts with our parents, I think, doesn't it? And his dad was a relatively prosperous guy in Connecticut, but fell on hard times after the French and Indian War, and really fell out of disrepute in his family, and became, for lack of a better word, a drunken wharf rat. In fact, Benedict had to go pick him up and take him out of jail, and Benedict was put into he was an indentured servant for a family friend, and they really admired him and empowered him and helped him on his way. And he was a self-made man, so that by the time the revolution comes along, he's one of the leaders in New Haven, Connecticut. But he always has his dad on his shoulder, right? The disgrace of his father really pushed him to become a self-made man, and also made him extremely sensitive to what he viewed as any slights. And so that overblown sense of honor, that wanting to lead, wanting to leave his father behind, all drove him to a leadership of the revolution. Unfortunately, it also became, I think, the monkey on his back, that when things didn't go well in the revolution, he listened to the dark side and didn't listen to the better angels of his nature. And so that drove him into the British hands. But it all sort of started with Dad and his downfall.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit more about his downfall? I guess you can tell us how it started, but maybe it might have started when he was overlooked for a promotion. Can you talk about what he did to put himself in a position for a promotion, and then why do you think he didn't receive that promotion?
Well, first of all, he was crazy brave, and a really great leader, and really, really good at strategy. So he kept doing really successful things. He led an attack on Fort Ticonderoga with the disreputable Ethan Allen. He then took ships and actually attacked Canada and captured and controlled Lake Champlain. He then later led a really brave attack up over the mountains in Maine and to Quebec. And by that point, he really was in line and should have been promoted. Ultimately, he was made a general, but his seniority was less than other less accomplished men. And again, with that overblown sense of honor, when he was overlooked, it really upset him. Now, it's important to note that at that time, a lot of these guys behave badly about my seniority versus your seniority and that sort of thing. But Benedict really couldn't let it go. And when they were even more so approving major generals, it was apportioned by state. And so there was already a recognized major general in Connecticut. And so he could not get the major generalship. And Washington told him that it was a mistake and that he felt really bad about it, and tried to support him. But at the end of the day, those kind of things Benedict could not let go of, right? And that, along with some severe injuries and other slights, really drove him into the British arms, along with, frankly, his second wife. And while I don't think it's her fault, she played a major role in his decisions.
You mentioned major injuries. I wanted to ask a little bit more about what happened to him at Saratoga when his leg got crushed and he refused to let them amputate his leg. I guess I'm curious about it because you say it's very painful, but I can't imagine at that time living with such an injury. I get cortisone shots every 3 months to help me with my hip pain. Like, how did that affect his life?
Well, your insight there is very good because pain makes you irritable, right? Makes you impatient, distracts you. And I think his pain was a major contributor to his becoming ultimately a traitor. There's, I always think becoming a traitor is a little like there was a lot of studies done in the 80s about how people became traitors by the CIA that were declassified that I read. And it's almost like a plane crash. It's a series of events that eventually lead you to that bad place. And one of the things was this terrible injury. He broke his femur. He got the horse he was on was shot and it collapsed onto his femur. And as I say in the book, it's not like he broke his femur; it was shattered like a walnut. Um, and that's the largest bone in your body. And they did want to amputate it. He wouldn't let him do it. He uh, survived despite it, although his right leg that broke would always be, excuse me, his left leg that broke would always be much shorter than his other leg. In fact, he had special shoes made. And through the rest of his life, he would periodically take a knife and then pull a bone shard out. So it was sort of constantly digging into his flesh every step he made. As he talked about it, for every moment of the rest of his life, he felt sharp pain in his leg. And that extreme irritant, um, just like his father's dishonor, I think we're always whispering in his ears to give in to the dark side. And I think it was played no small role.
Tell me more about his time in Philadelphia. He was given a position there, and then his lifestyle became very opulent. Why do you think, what was the position, and why did his lifestyle change so much?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, this is after he broke his leg or his leg, shattered his leg. He cannot yet ride a horse. And Washington makes the worst decision, one of the worst decisions he made of the revolution. He says, well, I'm going to put my impolitic, irritable, um, haughty guy in charge of what was then really a cesspool that was Philadelphia. There was the extreme radicals. We think of the revolution as being monolithic, but there were the radicals in Philadelphia led by a guy named Joseph Reed, and there were Quakers. And I mean, Joseph Reed's kind of main entertainment was killing Quakers. I mean, he was a terrible guy. And Benedict had lost a lot of money. In fact, he had a ship that he had essentially donated the revolution that was lost. He was a wealthy man, but was not by the time he arrived in Philadelphia. And he viewed this as a chance for him to recuperate in comfort. He chose the Penn Mansion, by the way, that the British had been occupying. He chose a nice carriage because it had good springs on it because his leg hurt so much. But the radicals saw him as, continuing the occupation of the British had. And that he also, by the way, engaged in a number of fairly questionable business dealings, one of which later he was censured for. And because he wanted to start making some money. But a lot of colonial officers, by the way, did engage in what we would view as completely improper practices. But they did do that. His maybe were a little more over the line than some, but he was there to make money. He was there to recuperate. And yet he was in a location with these ultra radicals who hated not only him, because he was the surrogate of George Washington. And George Washington was sort of above repute. So the person you could safely attack was Benedict. And they just viciously attacked him almost continuously from the moment of his arrival. It really made his life there hell. And again, another thing pushing him to the dark side, pushing him to the British. It was a whole series of events.
And I don't know how much you want to give away. Obviously, everyone can go in and look at the history of Benedict Arnold, but what eventually did push him over the edge, and what did he do?
Um, first of all, I think the singular event was his he was put on trial for these sort of financial improprieties. He borrowed some wagons and helped to get some stuff off a ship, and he was ultimately censured by Washington for that. And I think that he felt betrayed by someone who had really become his father figure, George Washington. And I think that was the last straw. He had actually already been in contact with the British before that, but I think that, with the urging of his then wife, Peggy, really caused him to embrace his conversations with Major John Andre, who Peggy had known when the British occupied Philadelphia. Major John Andre, then Captain Andre, was in Philadelphia, and they had met each other. There's some people that say they had more than a friendship, but I think that's unlikely. But she was able to connect Benedict with him after British left Philadelphia. And those actions of some of the people he cared most about, he felt betrayed not only by the radicals, but also he felt betrayed by Washington, who really did not protect him from the radicals. And I think from an emotional standpoint, Washington's lack of support probably was the ultimate final straw that caused him to start engaging with the British.
And I'm curious, the war had been going on for many years at this point. What were the circumstances of the war, and did it even matter? Was he going to go to the British no matter who the ultimate winner of the war would be?
Yeah, one of the turning points of the war was 1777, which was known of the year of the three hangmen, because it looks like three little gallows. And from that point on until 1780, when Benedict starts really doing his bad stuff, the officer corps was really, really, really suffering. And there had been a number of major defeats. We think of the Spirit of 76 and 77 when Washington succeeds at Valley when he crosses the Trenton River and succeeds on Christmas Day with the Hessians. But on the other hand, after that, it's really not a great war. And Washington fights what's called the Fabian strategy. And he never really, his only job is to preserve the army and hold out with the Brits. And the officer corps gets increasingly disillusioned. And I think ultimately, by 1780, there's been large surrenders, most notably a large surrender in Charleston. There's been a lot of defeats. And it really, everybody, and the British have sent a thing called the Carlisle Commission to basically offer the Americans everything they wanted when the revolution started. And there's a lot of officers and there's a lot of men who are disillusioned. There were a number of rebellions by troops, including troops from Connecticut. And all that together meant it was greatly disillusioned. And Benedict believed that if he led, and by the way, part of his goal was to decapitate the leadership, including having Washington captured. But if he could cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, potentially capture Washington, he could lead the British Regiment to take over the country. And he really viewed himself as someone who could turn the revolution. And frankly, so did the British. So it was a real opportunity that he really thought he could win.
Well, it's clear after talking to you for a little bit here that you know a lot about this history. You've done a lot of research for this novel, but it is in fact a novel. So tell me about fictionalizing aspects of the history. What did you do, and how does that make it more engaging for readers?
Yeah, so research my book's a little different than a lot of historical fiction. I have about 50 or more pages of author's notes, bibliographies, and explanations. I think so. My book's I always like to say it's about 98% nonfiction. The 2% is you get to hear what he says and thinks, but a lot of time that is, and Benedict here is in the first person, so it's what Benedict thinks, is informed by the dialogue's informed by actual letters we have. So it did X, Y, or Z happen? What happened with Ethan Allen? Did he have an affair, or did his wife have an affair with Major John Andre? You can go to the back of the book and read what the nonfiction historians say. So I start with the nonfiction story, and I do a lot of research that really narrows what's going on. And then the fun part is, and you and I were talking about this before, it's that transcendental moment when you've got all the nonfiction stuff in your head and you've got everything that happened in a particular scene. And then for me, I tend to wake up in the middle of the night and I hear voices in my head. And that's the dialogue. That's Benedict talking to George. That's Benedict talking to his wife. That's Benedict talking to his soldiers. And that moment when you hear them talking is why I'm going to keep writing, I think, until I'm no longer around, because it is the intense research that allows me to be there in factually, but it's the the voice in my head that gives it meaning, and why it's ultimately historical fiction and not literary nonfiction or nonfiction, right? I think it's more engaging to actually hear Benedict or hear George than just hear a third party about what they might have said and we don't really know. So that's the joy of writing historical fiction.
So you're becoming George Washington was about 5 years ago. You said your next novel will be 5 years. So tell me about your process and why you stick to that length of time to get a new novel out.
Yeah, because it's the research. Um, I I I I do a lot of research. I read a lot of books, and my process is I have the outline. So my next book is called Becoming Victorious. So it's going to be from the fall of Charleston to victory at Yorktown, and it's an incredible, the Southern Campaign. It's an incredible story with basically five protagonists, and I know the outline of the story. And each book I read, I learn more and more and more about some part of that outline, and I fill it in and I drop footnotes. And it gets denser and denser and denser. And Benedict, at its peak, he probably had about 2,300 footnotes. Um, those then get converted to author's notes in the back and get simplified. And each time that book, another book gets added, I tend to learn more and more and more and more and more until I've read everything I can find and I'm really not learning anymore. And somewhere along that process, scenes start converting from an outline, non-fair, non-fiction narrative to a historical fiction narrative because I can hear the voices. That's my process. It takes a long time, right? And by the way, it's the journey that defines this, not the goal, right? So for me, getting the books, reading the books, writing, that's a lot of fun. It's also fun doing this. I enjoy this. I enjoy the other half of the process, but I also enjoy the journey. And part of it is the research, and part of it is the writing. I like the editing less. I like less when, especially when the editors beat you up, which is part of their jobs. But it's a great process, and it takes a long time, and that's okay. So the next book, it'll probably be 5 years. My wife thinks I'll do it in less because I've got a little more time. My kids are gone, but we'll see.
Yeah, the editing can be very daunting, but it's really the only way to make it into a compelling, to make it the best novel it can be.
Exactly.
You come with a background as a lawyer. Does that contribute in some way to your ability to tell these stories?
I would say yes and no. I had never written any dialogue before, George, but you do a lot of research, right? Research. I was a trained researcher. That's pretty much what especially a litigator did. So I think that's part of it. I'm used to taking very complex things, synthesizing them and making them accessible. I mean, that my old boss used to say that if you can't in plain language explain something to a jury, then you're not a good lawyer, right? And so I work really hard in the books in making them accessible with language that's accessible, still trying to keep the flavor of the way they talked. But so I think that helps being a lawyer. Um, but also the journey of writing here was different too. And I haven't had to do that level of description and that level of dialogue. And that was also really fun. And I think I enjoyed it as much doing the first book as I did in the second, right? It's again that hearing voices in your head thing that is really cool that you never get when you're drafting a brief for a judge, right? So, or gosh, a complaint. So but actually, as a lawyer, I did do fairly well on that because I did try to write my briefs as my boss taught me in an accessible way because judges are human beings too, right? And juries are human beings, and you want to tell a story that is compelling that makes them want to vote your way, or in this case, for me, turn the page.
Tell me about your audiobook. We talked a little bit about this before the interview. You and I both had the same narrator for our audiobooks. So tell me why you decided to go with an audiobook and about working with the narrator and about what's different about the audiobook for readers than, say, reading it as a paperback.
Yeah, well, first of all, we both have great taste. Let's just Scott is terrific, and our narrator. And what's cool about him, by the way, for folks that are watching this, he's from Cornwall, England. So when you talk to him, when he's not narrating, he's got a Cornish English accent, but he can do all these American accents and Southern accents, and he can do women's voices. People ask me if first of all, when I did my first book, I wasn't focused on audiobooks, but it was so interesting on this book. So many more people were like, "Oh, do you have audiobooks?" I'm like, "Well, I guess I do." Right. And then people asked whether I should do it myself. And as everybody can tell, my voice manages to be both nasally and gravelly at the same time. So I didn't think my voice would be particularly engaging. Um, it was really interesting and fun. First of all, he's a super professional. So he helped, and I can't speak for you, but for me, he helped me through the process. I hadn't done it before. You would listen to the book and there would be some words that he would, not pronounce right, although for the most part, he was spectacular. And I've gotten really positive feedback about having done the audiobook. So I'll definitely do it again in my next book. Um, it's part of the new world, right? There's some people that are accessing books differently and you got to adapt to it. And by the way, I personally really like audiobooks. So I tend to read for writing my books, what I would call hard stuff, but I listen to it, I think is fairly entertaining things. So other historical fiction, that sort of thing. So I read nonfiction. I tend to listen to historical fiction. And again, it was a really fun process.
So I actually regularly read audiobooks. It helps me to multitask. I can't always multitask, but if I'm doing simple things, repetitive things, it's nice to have an audiobook and be able to read more books that way. When I published my novel as an audiobook, it was the first time I did it, and I was very surprised at how complicated the process was because for readers out there, we all know that the publication process is long and it goes through editing and proofing and design and all those things. Well, the audiobook can be just as extensive, and I didn't know that you need to listen back to every chapter and give notes. And I actually, at the time, I was training for the Twin Cities Marathon, and I would listen while I was out training. But that was challenging because then I had to remember the spots. I couldn't stop and write them down. But yeah, it's another part of publishing a novel. But it is really great to be able to have those available as audiobooks and to have a great actor like Scott Fleming be able to bring those voices to life.
Well, I don't know how you could, because for me, I would listen and I'd be like, 1 hour, 23 minutes, 15 seconds. You use this word, we need to use this word right now. And especially you, because you have a lot of Ojibwe words, which I'm sure would be a lot harder for a guy from Cornwall, England. So, but still, it is weird, by the way, to hear your own words coming out through someone else's very talented mouth. It was,
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you, but it would bring me back to the moment when I wrote those words. It's kind
yeah,
of interesting.
yeah, it's fabulous.
Well, let's just get back to Benedict Arnold here a little bit. What do he's become such a, I don't know how you would call it. He's more of a caricature of a person rather than an actual person, and people just kind of make fun of him for committing treason all those years ago. How do you think Benedict Arnold should be perceived, and what do you want readers to come away with about this man after reading your novel?
What's interesting, some people thought like I'm defending Benedict Arnold, and I'm not. He's a bad dude. He's a Darth Vader like figure, right? He gave in to the dark side, and he was a very, very accomplished general. He was our greatest general. And I think one of the things that I hope readers will take away from it is his treachery was all the more profound because he was our greatest battlefield general. He Washington, when he learned of the treachery, he said, "Whom can we trust now?" In modern parlance, if not Benedict, who can I trust, right? And so the scale of his treachery was monumental, um, which is why it's so deeply ingrained in the American heart and psyche. To understand, when you really understand the story and really understand how close America came to losing the revolution because of his treachery, we understand how deeply it affected everyone at the time and continues to affect us even to this day. He becomes the definition of a traitor. And his story, though, is not like Iago or Richard III, this just inherently evil guy. Um, it's a journey from an impressive young man who builds his fortune to a guy who ultimately commits a terrible act of treason, um, and how at each stage he pushed inexorably in that direction. And that story is really compelling. And that's what I hope people understand. It's more nuanced. Excuse me, now I have the cough. But it's a it's he's more than just the two-dimensional character we all have of treason. He's still a bad guy. I don't want to ruin it for everybody. He's not a great guy, but he also was a great general, and a brilliant tactician and a very accomplished business person, and a loving husband. He loved both his wives, and decent father, but um, but deeply, deeply, deeply flawed, which led him to the dark side.
For viewers, they can see your shirt. For those listening on audio, do you want to tell us about the shirt you're wearing for this today?
Yeah. So for those that can't see me, my shirt is half Union Jack, half Stars and Stripes, and I had this made for my book release party, and I really wish in my heart that I would have been a revolutionary. When you write these books, you spend a lot of time thinking about this. Would I have been a revolutionary? Would I have been a loyalist? I mean, Benedict went back and forth. And when you look at all the objective tests, I'm a rule follower, I benefit from our existing system, blah, blah. My wife, by the way, has a whole bunch of other tests, whether you're revolutionary or not, like, will you sit in your seats at a ball game, and do you like to get to the airport early? But whatever the test is, I fall in the loyalist camp, which really upsets me. Okay. So, but on the other hand, I really wish I'd be a rebel, right? I mean, I would hope that I would have sided with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all the others. But I'm in my life, I tend to go to the loyalist camp. So my shirt reflects the two halves of me. Now, the only good news is my wife is absolutely a rebel, 100% rebel. And so sometimes spouses played a major role in which side they ended up being on. And I think my wife would have dragged me hopefully over to the light and had me be a rebel. But my shirt reflects the duality of my own existence. And I still think about it. I still think about it more than I probably should, but I would hope that I would be a rebel, notwithstanding that I seem to be a loyalist.
I've never heard of those tests, but I might have to go try one.
I don't know. I think you're kind of rebel-y. I got a feeling you'd be a rebel. I like my wife. I think you're better adjusted than I am, but I spend a life following rules, and a lot of lawyers, although there's notable exceptions, John Adams most of all, right? So anyway, so that's why I love this shirt. It's a little bit of both.
I'm glad you wore it today. Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining me. Congratulations on becoming Benedict Arnold, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
It's wonderful being with you again. Thank you very much, Colin.